seat. We are going to get started on our third session here. I hope you had a chance to get a break, catch your breath, get some food. While the lights are up, before they get dimmed and I can't see you anymore, how many of you traveled from out of state? Raise your hand. Oh, that's great. How many, East Coasters? Hey, welcome. Not that the Midwest doesn't count. I am Central Standard Time, but if you came from the East Coast, any out-of-country travelers? Oh, yay. Where'd you come from? Norway. Wow, welcome. My wife was born in Norway, and that's all that she has to do with Norway. But she was raised in Scotland, though. And you, sir? Romania. Romania. He was one of my students. So great to have you guys. Well, welcome. And everybody else is California. No? No. Well, if you're not out of... Okay, so our first session was outside the walls. Our second session was inside of the walls. And our third session is leaping over walls. So that is going to be a great deal of fun. And I'm going to introduce our three presenters, and they will speak in turn. And this is going to be a non-boring session, I promise you. Not that the others were boring, but this is going to be truly non-boring. No pressure. Todd Johnson, if online people, welcome also, just wherever you are, I'm looking at you. Todd Johnson joined Fuller Seminary in 2005 and is the William K. and Dolores S. Brehm Associate Professor of Worship Theology and the Arts. As a faculty member for the Center for Advanced Theological Studies, he was the lead professor in the PhD concentration in Christian worship. He also launched the new PhD program in worship and preaching in the fall of 2017 with Michael Pasquarello, and serves as the theological director of the Brehm Center. He is also the author of Performing the Sacred, which is a wonderful book on the theater arts as they relate to theology, and is a co-editor on the book The Conviction of Things Not Seen, Worship and Ministry in the 21st Century, also a good book. Cutter Calloway, our second speaker, joined the School of Theology faculty in 2015 as assistant professor of theology and culture, and has been actively engaged in writing and speaking on the interaction between theology and culture, specifically film, television, and online media in both academic and popular forums, and is the author of Scoring Transcendence, Watching TV Religiously, and his book that is coming out this year, what date? May, The Aesthetics of Atheism. He also wrote a wonderful book about marriage, breaking the idols that we have about marriage. I commend those to you. And then our last speaker is Makoto Fujimura, who is the director of Culture Care Initiative here at Fuller, and is an artist who has exhibited globally. He is a writer, specifically wrote a wonderful book called Refractions, which is a series of reflections on art and faith, wrote another collection of essays called Culture Care, Reflections on Art and Faith, which I've used in my class, wonderful books, and then is coming out with a book called Theology of Making. Mako, if you're in the room, when is that coming out? He is not in the room. It's coming out this year. I know Tom Wright is writing a foreword for it, so it's going to be an excellent, and he'll be talking about that. And he was once the presidential appointee to the National Council on the Arts, 2003 to 2009, and a wonderful human being as well. So join me in welcoming Todd Johnson.
Well, I'd like to begin with a confession. I speak this afternoon after lunch with no small amount of anxiety, because speaking after lunch reminds me of being in afternoon kindergarten when after you had your graham crackers and carton of milk, you pulled out your mats and took a nap. And that reminds me of the fact that the first day of kindergarten, for me, I disintegrated. Well, not actually disintegrated. I had a moment of disintegration, because when I entered the kindergarten classroom for my afternoon kindergarten class at Third Ward Elementary School, I entered a wonderful space. There were shelves with books and toys. There were games. there were desks and chairs my size, and it was filled with people my size, people I had never met before. And rather than causing anxiety, this was kind of an exciting thing for me. And then in the back, they had these bins of wooden blocks, big blocks and small blocks, and they had these 3 wooden trucks that you could sit on and ride across the classroom and ride into the shins of Mrs. Franey. And it was just a wonderful experience. And everything was going swimmingly until on that first day, they invited us to all stand up. And I'm looking around the room as I'm standing, and there I see on the wall signs with blocks of color and the word of a color written next to it, and pictures of animals with the name of the animal written next to it. And above the chalkboard in the front of the classroom was this litany of uppercase and lowercase print block letters from A to Z. And on another wall, you had numbers from 1 to 20. And they asked us to stand up and to pay attention to one thing, and it was none of those. We want you to go and put your hand over your heart and turn, and there's this piece of cloth hanging on a stick over there. And we want you to say these words after us. That was a moment of disintegration for me. There is nothing in my life that prepared me for that moment, because never in my life, all 5 years of it, had an adult ever told me to speak to an inanimate object. Never once. But I learned that this was an exceptional moment in my life, and I also know it was going to be a repeated moment throughout my life, beginning that day. And for the rest of the year, my hunch was reinforced, because I pledged allegiance to that flag every day I was in school, but never once pledged allegiance to either an integer or an upper or lowercase letter. Never once to an animal or a color, but only the flag. But it wasn't an unusual experience for me, because I grew up in a religious family. I grew up in church, as much as you can grow up by the time you're 5. So there were combinations of words and actions that were familiar to me. We prayed in our church and in Sunday school and in our home. And when we prayed, there were gestures that went with it. In fact, our table blessing, the ones we'd say in English and not in Swedish, instructions came with them. Our hands we fold, our heads we bow. For food and drink we thank thee now. Amen. That's pretty simple. I mean, the only thing it doesn't say is close your eyes, but that was implied by bowing your head, wasn't it? And then in my bedroom, my parents hung this picture of a little boy, blonde hair, Dr. Denton's, back door trap snapped up, kneeling beside his bed, head bowed, eyes closed, hands folded, moon in the window so you knew it was nighttime. So I said, oh, when you pray at night, you must kneel by your bed. And so I did. So words and gestures went together, and I didn't think much of them. And most of the time we don't, do we? We do all sorts of gesturing while we speak, all sorts of acting while we speak, but we never think of them as exceptional until something unusual or unexpected happens that causes disintegration in us, causes us to say, oh, that's not quite right. And the reason is that these things that we do, these gestures that we make that accompany our words, are symbols. And symbols are dangerous, slippery things. Let me explain. If I had a hammer, I'd hammer in the morning. I would hammer out things that got the feelings from those imprecatory psalms out of my body. I would hammer things. I would hammer nails. Because it's a tool, it does something. But if you were to come back to our session this afternoon and the doors would have been shut, and on the doors would have been a picture of a hammer, and I was pounding inside, you would say to yourself, oh, that sign's telling me someone's pounding inside, we'll wait here. That sign would have one referent, that is, the work being done in this space. A stop sign means stop. Let me repeat that, those of you in California. A stop sign means stop. It's a sign, it means one thing. But if you take a hammer, for instance, and cross it with a sickle, you have a semiotic alchemy take place. All of a sudden, it explodes in possible meanings. It's the Soviet Union. It's Leninism. It's Marxism. It's communism. It's all things evil that oppose that flag that I pledge allegiance to, isn't it? It's a symbol, no longer a sign. If you take that stop sign, put a frame around it, and hang it into a museum of contemporary art, you've created a symbol, not a sign. And symbols are dangerous because symbols can be misinterpreted, misunderstood, and symbols can create friction, disharmony, discordance, and disintegration. So when we do things like bow heads, clasp hands, close eyes, and kneel, it doesn't surprise us or offend us until it does. First slide, please. This is Eric Reed beside his teammate, Colin Kaepernick. In 2016, the preseason, Colin Kaepernick made a decision that he would not stand for a flag that promises liberty and justice for all when his experience of that country was not that. He could not stand for it and would not. So Colin Kaepernick decided to sit for the national anthem for the first two games. This is where the story becomes very interesting. There happened to be an aerial shot of the stadium, I believe it's actually San Diego, in which the national anthem was sung, and there's a still photo, and looking down, you can see there's one player on the 49ers bench that's not standing, but sitting on the bench. Someone zoomed in and discovered it was Kaepernick, and all of a sudden, his cover was blown. So people came to him, why weren't you standing for the national anthem? What was going on that prevented you from doing it? Are you injured? Is there some reason? He said, given all that's happening in the lives of black people in this country, from coast to coast, north and south, I cannot, with good conscience, say that I am supportive and enthusiastically supportive of our country. So I decided to sit down. Well, news of this spread across our country. Enter Nate Boyer. Nate Boyer is a diehard San Francisco fan. After high school, he went into the Army, joined the Green Berets, served 2 or 3 tours of duty with the Green Beret. If you know anything about the Green Beret, their motto is to always liberate. So many of his tasks were to protect people from genocide and from other forms of violence because of their nationality, religion, color of their skin. He was proud of his country and proud of the work he did. After he finished his career in the military, he decided to go to college. He's in his late 20s by this point. Goes to the University of Texas, joins the football team. He is most prominently known there for the person who led the team onto the field when playing in their home stadium, carrying the American flag. He tried to get a job in a professional football team, actually played some preseason games, but never was taken by a team. But he realized the transition from military life into civilian life and professional athletes into civilian life was difficult, and actually created charities to help athletes in military support each other in these transitions, to help create networks of employment opportunities. So he was asked, because of his knowledge of the military and of his knowledge of professional sports, particularly football, to write an essay for Military Times about his feeling about Colin Kaepernick. What Boyer chose to do was to write an open letter to Colin Kaepernick. And it began by saying how proud of him he was as a 49ers fan to be an athlete that has performed so well on the field and has done so much charitable work, in particular supporting the care and concern for veterans, which he himself has been directly involved in. But then said, but I'm disappointed that you don't have more hope in our country. Knowing it's not perfect, Sitting out means that you're disengaged, that you're stepping away, and that's not the sort of person that I know you to be. And I hope that one day you might find it in you to have enough hope and optimism for a better day for our country that I might be able to stand beside you and we will stand together for the national anthem on a sideline. Kaepernick was so taken by this letter that he said, I need to speak to this person. It was such an even-handed, firm, but even-handed response that he arranged a meeting and invited his teammate, Eric Reed, who felt similarly to himself, to join them. So they met. And it was there that Nate Boyer suggested maybe the posture you need that won't be so offensive isn't sitting, but kneeling. Because on the field of battle, when a comrade goes down, when a woman or man is injured or, heaven forbid, has given their life, you take a knee. You take a knee. When my daughters played lacrosse and soccer and someone was injured on the field, every player took a knee from both teams as a sign of solidarity until that player was cared for. Maybe you could respect the flag and still show your solidarity with those people for whom you feel so much by taking a knee. So the next game, Colin Kaepernick did. Next slide, please. And beside him is Nate Boyer, hand over his heart, proud to be with his friend, Colin Kaepernick, proud to have helped him negotiate a non-controversial way of expressing his feelings. But you see, symbols are slippery. Just because you intend it to mean something doesn't mean it can mean that to everyone who interprets it, does it? We live in a disintegrating time, a time when it's difficult to communicate to one another, a time when it's difficult to listen to people who think of the world differently than you do. But we, sisters and brothers, have been called to be integrators, ambassadors of reconciliation, Paul calls us, which means we need to be patient. We need to be humble. When someone says, does, or creates something that surprises us, offends us, makes us scratch our heads, makes us angry, our first response ought not to be judgment. Our first response ought to be, I wonder what they intended to mean when they did this. Might we have such a gracious response as Nate Boyer did, not hesitating to express his own opinions about the matter, but seeking to create a conversation and dialogue even amongst disagreement. There is so much that divides us inside the church. There is so much that divides us outside the church. Are we willing to swallow our pride, to take the time to listen to the other, to really listen to the other in ways that integration might occur in our churches, in our community, and in our world? I think this is something that anyone with a kindergarten education should agree to. Thank you.
Need to pause for a minute. Title of my thing that we're about to see. It's called The Aesthetics of Atheism in a Divided World. David put me in the leaping over the walls category after we're done. I'm not sure if there will be any more walls. You can tell me. What exactly does the death of God sound like? What does it look like? What does it feel like? Probably something like this. My God, why have you forsaken me? Certain elements of the story may be somewhat apocryphal, but what isn't in question is that Ernest Rutherford's gold leaf experiment radically shifted humanity's understanding of material reality. Rutherford, known by some as the father of nuclear physics, designed an experiment in which he sent alpha particles through a few pieces of gold leaf. The result confirmed that atoms, and therefore all physical objects, are indeed comprised of mostly empty space. Legend has it that the following morning, Rutherford woke up and swung his feet over the side of his bed as he always did. But on this particular day, he found himself paralyzed with fear. He could not bring himself to set his feet upon the ground because he was convinced that he would simply fall through the floor. The image of Rutherford dangling his legs over the side of his bed, staring down at what he understood to be an infinite abyss of empty space beneath him, offers a kind of living metaphor for the existential state in which many contemporary people find themselves. Everyone may not articulate it in precisely this way, but it's increasingly the case that many feel deep within their lived experience a certain kind of angst and anxiety, driven by the fact that they can no longer trust the ground beneath their feet to hold them up. Their awareness of how the world is structured has so fundamentally shifted that when it comes to pressing questions about belief and non-belief, theism and atheism, it's as if they're sitting on their beds, feet hanging over the edge, and all they see before them is a vast and empty expanse.
How did I get here? How did I get here? Is it real? Is it real? How did I get here? Is it real? Is it real? How did I get here? Is it real? Is it real? How did I get here? Is it real?
One of the primary reasons for this kind of paralysis is that we too often think about theism and atheism as if they were located at the opposite ends of an infinite divide, forever in conflict or in need of reconciliation. But it's not just ardent atheists who operate as if the opposition between theism and atheism is self-evident. A number of prominent Christian thinkers also suggest that contemporary atheism is inherently incompatible with any sort of theism, especially Christianity. From this view, the choice is clear and simple. One must either reject atheism in favor of theism, or vice versa. For nothing can bridge this divide. If only things were so straightforward and simple. You see, rather than a failure on the part of non-believers, what this atheistic impulse actually reveals is a lack or a malfunction within the Christian imagination. It signals a yearning within the human person that is for one reason or another not satisfied by traditional religious expressions. As a consequence, the way forward cannot be a matter of choosing between either atheism or theism, but neither is it to bring together both theism and atheism in a way that generates some kind of magical synthesis between the two. Both of these options simply reinforce the entrenched narratives of the divided world in which we live. The stories that separate us from the very neighbors we are called to love. Rather than either or both and, to get out of bed and actually walk upon the empty space below, one must navigate a much more daunting reality. Neither nor.
Are you even here? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is everything going to be okay? Are you even here? Is every
whether one identifies as a believer or a non-believer. There's an increasingly urgent need to move beyond the unhelpful and reductive categories that were handed to us, especially for all those who, despite their supposedly secular surroundings, continue to find themselves haunted by the perverse core of Christianity. Which is exactly why when people of Christian faith choose to listen closely to contemporary atheism rather than hold it at arm's length, what comes into view is a much deeper and more textured reality lying just beneath the surface of the rigid and artificial binary of belief-unbelief. Namely, to engage the world theologically, much less Christianly, one must go through the atheistic experience. At least that's what Jesus' cry on the cross suggests. Indeed, it's not incidental that Jesus chose to quote Psalm 22 with his dying breath, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The gospel accounts provide both the Greek and Aramaic versions of his final words. The divine Father, according to these texts, forsakes or abandons the Son. But in the original Hebrew poem, the psalmist accuses God of something far more disturbing: apostasy. In this moment, a rupture of epic proportions occurs. God apostatizes against God's very self. Now, whether religious or not, few of us want to follow this line of thought where it truly leads, and for good reason. It's too radical. It doesn't really matter if one's context is bourgeois or bohemian, post-liberal or alt-right. This kind of divine atheism can only ever disrupt, unsettle, and disperse. Its critical edge cannot be softened. It can't be domesticated, nor can it be co-opted, for no one possesses it. It's why G.K. Chesterton suggested that there is, quote, only one religion, that is Christianity, in which God seemed for an instant to be an atheist. But just because something is unsettling doesn't mean that it's heretical. In fact, it's quite often the very opposite. Even though it's often upsetting for Christians to hear Nietzsche's proclamation that God is dead, God's abandonment of God on the cross is in fact the origin of the Christian faith. Needless to say, the further we go down this atheistic rabbit hole, the more any simple concept of God, theism, and atheism just falls apart. To be sure, the allure of oversimplification will always persist, but contemporary atheism resists such easy enticements. If anything, it moves in the opposite direction, toward rather than away from complexity. In so doing, it provides a unique lens by which to catch a glimpse, perhaps for the first time, of the scandalous heart of the Christian faith. So an aesthetics of atheism is an exploration of the dispositions and sentiments of a society moving increasingly toward a post-theistic future, toward a world of new gods and new ideas. It names an attempt to capture the mood, the spirit of the times, through an exploration of particular pieces of art, specific artists, and the shifting dynamics of religion in the 21st century. In this way, an aesthetics of atheism serves as both a site for theological exploration and an essential resource for articulating the Christian faith in a way that contemporary people might actually understand, a way that leaps over the walls that the modern world has erected. But even this claim masks one that is much more radical. The strong aesthetic vision that both animates and orients contemporary atheism actually opens a kernel of Christianity that is otherwise inaccessible. More so than anything else, it's the aesthetic shape of atheism that provides it with such profound religious insights. It's also both more and different than that, for the aesthetic vision of atheism actually creates the very conditions for faith, especially Christian faith. Consider again the tale of Ernest Rutherford and the plunge into chaos that threatened his existence that fateful morning. At first blush, it appears as if he was limited to one of two options. He could either ignore his newfound knowledge and step with naive certainty upon the firm and stable ground beneath him, or he could remain forever in his bed, paralyzed by the sheer terror of a world without any kind of meaningful substance. In fact, though, another option was available to him. It's one that admittedly requires a bit more imagination to see, an aesthetic sensibility, if you will. Rather than sit courageously on his bed or stand defiantly on the floor, Ernest Rutherford could have taken the more poetic route and danced on the edge of the abyss. If dancing seems like a counterintuitive response to an existential crisis of this or any other kind, that's because it is. But for those seeking to establish new coordinates in the wake of the death of God, it may be the only way forward. This isn't about exerting one's will to power over a cold and meaningless universe. It's about giving meaning to form. For within the ever-emerging context of contemporary Western culture, the dawning of each day presents a new set of difficulties that were literally inconceivable just moments before. So much is changing at such increasingly rapid rates that, in certain respects, change itself has changed. The religious landscape that was once imagined as timeless, fixed, and permanent has undergone a radical upheaval. As a consequence, when it comes to explorations of belief and unbelief, theism and atheism, faith and doubt, the only thing of which anyone can be sure today is that the once stable ground of certainty has given way and revealed a gaping chasm. Needless to say, there's no going back to a time when things were more steady and sure. But it also won't do any good to stay in bed forever. So we might as well get up and dance. The Illumin Playback Theater. Give them a hand one more time. These guys are great.
Thank you, Playback Theater, Illumin Playback Theater, and thank you, Cutter. Thank you, David. Thank you for this gathering, which so many of us artists long to have this conversation of newness, this idea that artists are always looking for the future. And Christians ought to be looking toward the future. Christians ought to be futurists. And through dance and through art, through music, through what we do as artists, we are invoking the new. And part of my language, part of my role is to provide a language so all of us, whether you're artists or not, can join in that dance. The title of my talk has to do with cultural estuary, and you might wonder, what in the world is that? It's a term that I've been using in my idea of culture care, or the book Culture Care. I speak about this need for us in a divided, polarized, divisive world to be forced into a rich, abundant ecosystem. And an estuary is defined as a water passage where the tide meets a river current. So it's where the salt water mixes with fresh water. I write this: much of the Hudson River, like all of the intricate waterways around New York City, is an estuary. In an estuary, salt water mixes with fresh, bringing together multiple ecological layers and habitats to form the world's most diverse and most abundant ecosystem. This abundance arises from an environment that is delicately balanced and often harsh. An environmental scientist recently told me that while an invigorated estuary contains many pockets of homogeneity, like beds of eelgrass or oysters, it is ultimately heterogeneous. For these pockets are all in contact and often in competition with each other. And each pocket is subject to the ebbs and flows of the estuarial system, including variations in salt concentrations and sediments from the interactions of rivers and tidal waters. Estuaries are the most abundant and the most needed part of the ecosystem, but it is the most delicate. That's why if you are trying to restore the ecosystem, the entire marine ecosystem, you have to start with the estuary. When the Hudson estuary was decimated by years and years of neglect, we lost the oyster beds and we lost millions of striped bass going back to Hudson every May. But they're now back, and I talk about this in my book. And one of the ways that we can test to see if a given culture is vibrant and is producing something meaningful to the world is to see if it is indeed an estuary. And so the early 20th century New York City, with all the immigrants coming in, rushing in from Europe, and creating a fantastic mixture of influences, everything from Harlem Renaissance to abstract expressionism, flourished in competition in New York City, much like the Hudson. 16th century Japan, where Portuguese and Italian missionaries came into Japan. And at the same time, there was this indigenous form of art that was beginning to take shape in Japan, what we now know as Japanese culture. It just previous to this is the period known as Sengoku Jidai, which means literally feudal war times. Unrest everywhere. Feudal powers vying to consolidate Japan through bloody means. And while that was taking place, a tea master named Senno Rikyu created an art form which influenced every category of the arts. What we know as Japanese art and aesthetic today goes back to him. He created an estuary. In this war-filled time, in this conflicted time, tension-filled time, when people were saying there's no future, we have to fight our way to dominate and to win. This artist stood in the way of that, and we owe him the entire legacy, I argue, of Japanese history. When I talk about culture care to policymakers, you know, people in Washington, D.C. is very busy, so you perhaps get 5 minutes to tell them everything I just said and the importance of how to create diversity in this divisive, polarized time when homogeneous thinking is no longer a way toward the future. In order to be a futurist, you have to think beyond your box. You have to create a dialogue and conversation that moves beyond the boundaries and these categories we created for ourselves. I bring with me a little bottle of this. Tabasco sauce was designed in 1868. So last year was the 150th anniversary of Tabasco sauce. And we all missed it. Why do I carry a little Tabasco sauce to policy meetings in Washington, D.C., where I talk to the young policymakers, conservative policymakers, and the arts policymakers who tends to be very liberal? Well, it's about color theory. When you take a class in color theory, any painting class, the teacher typically tells you two things not to do, which is to combine or put next to each other complementary or opposite colors. So they say don't put orange next to a bluish green or purple next to a yellow. Don't go look at Flutter logo now. Sorry. Because they will clash and they will create this incredible, they will compete against each other on the palette. It will be impossible to control, so avoid that. And furthermore, don't mix them because they become this muddy brown. What did the designer of Tabasco sauce do? Exactly that. And brilliantly, this design hasn't changed that much since 1868. Is to put opposite colors of one orange, dark red, reddish orange, which is a liquid, right? It's absolutely brilliant. And then design the green around it. So when it sits on the shelf of a supermarket, it stands out because of the opposite colors, fighting each other, and it draws your attention. And what does it communicate? Pick me. It communicates spiciness. As if that wasn't enough, they came up with another one recently, which is the opposite, but the same idea. These bottles lined up, says, pick me, I'm spicy. And I tell the policymakers, democracy needs to be spicy. Can we live with that? Well, if you have a good designer, if you have a good leader who understands the complexity of an estuary, of how a community may work, come together perhaps in a seminary of all places. If these people who I had been this enormous privilege to work with called the Fujimura Fellows, they come out in this so many ways, bringing their gifts and talents to ask this question, can we be reconciled? Can we be together as a church? Can we learn to follow Christ in our different perspectives and different personalities? Oftentimes, it's hard. But we do it because the designer artist, God, loves this. Dr. President Mark Labaton said in chapel, God is not colorblind. God is obsessed with color.
So, I've been listening into this conference and anticipating it for some time. And my heart is broken because I'm a student that graduated out of the Brehm Center as a worship theology and arts student. And today, what I saw, I don't know if you saw this, but this is what I saw. I saw as my worship assistants, people of color, came and shared their art. Aaron Dorsey played guitar for you this morning. Josh came and sang. January, and she's right there, by the way. I don't know if you got to hear her play violin, but she's pretty good. January and the Lumen Playback Theater came and shared their art today, but we weren't never given a platform to speak. See, what happens when the Brehm Center is just a body of people that only study what people of color do, but don't make space for us to share our own stories, for us to embody our own stories. And that breaks my heart, because there's beautiful art being made, but we're never given the platform to speak for ourselves. We're studied in this place of academia, but we don't get to tell our own stories. We're not just subjects. We can be teachers too. So make space for us, please. So I don't have to sit in the back and listen while other people try to articulate my story, or September's story, or Dia's story, or Jasmine's story, or Clover's story, or Renee's story, or January's story. Let me teach you. Give me a chance. We're going to do something today. We're going to try to embody this. So I'm going to ask all of us to rise to our feet. And our friends up here on the stage will also help us with this. We're going to try and make a giant circle. And we're going to practice something, and we're all going to try and make a giant circle, so we're going to have to move from our seats. Yes, let's do it. Let's open up.
Join us at the front.
Don't be afraid. Yes, come up to the front.
Come up front.
So we're about to partake in a moment and an opportunity. This is an opportunity for us to do something that will never happen again in history. It will be just this moment, because all of you are here, because I was here, because Mako's here, because September is here. We're all here, and we're going to take part in something that will in history never happen again. You're going to hear dissonance. You're going to hear chords being made as our voices come together. But this is only going to be possible because we all stood in a circle and all of us had an opportunity to contribute. And to see each other. So what we're going to do is a simple chant. We're just going to chant the word shalom. And as we do, really think about the places and spaces that need shalom. Shalom not just meaning our flat language of just peace. It's an embodied word. It's a disruptive word. And we don't get to see the completeness of shalom until all of us are at the table. So we're going to embody that now. It's very simple. I'm just going to start us off, and you're going to join me in unison. And after about singing that 3 times, I invite you to find any note you want to see, and there's no wrong note. There's never a wrong note. Dissonance is great. It's beautiful. Sit in the mess of that. And just pick a note and sing it. Change notes. Listen to what your neighbor is doing. Listen to what's being done across the room. And keep your eyes open to see your neighbor as we do this. All right, let's try it together. Shalom. Join me in unison. Shalom. Shalom. One more time. Shalom. Sing your harmonies. Shalom. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit we pray. That shalom would be here in this room and would go forth and change the ways that we see art. That art can't be done, God, without you and without one another, without diversity. And we want to be here to experience and be witnesses of the art that might emerge if all of us could find a way to find shalom in one another. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.
So we're going to have a panel come up now. Thank you. So that's what cultural history looks like. You just made it happen. So beautiful. Thank you.
Okay, are we on? We're on. Thank you, Mako. Thank you, Cutter. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Julie. I think you're over there somewhere. Thank you for leading us in that experience and experiment. And I think it proves, it demonstrates, I think the point that all three of you are making, that some things can only be known in the doing of them, not in the talking about them. So thank you for that, Julie. That was extraordinary. So this is a time for questions that you may have for any of our presenters. We have till the bottom of the half-hour mark, so we have about 25 minutes. I'm happy to start us off unless somebody has a question. Let's see. Who are my microphone holder people? There's Ed, and is Shannon still in service? There she is. Do you mind, Shannon? Oh, thank you. Let me just start you all off with a question. All three of you at some level are talking about things that are perhaps or seemingly or actually at odds with one another, rightly, wrongly, at odds, and they bring something good, at odds because they mistakenly see each other, at odds because they perceive things, the same thing, differently. And I'm wondering if you all can think of other examples, maybe that you've witnessed firsthand, of cultural estuary, of two competing things coming together, of atheism, theism coming together into a common space, and of gestures that have sort of this charged symbolic quality, uniting rather than maybe dividing. Todd. So if I can just, maybe I'll start with that, and then you guys can think of any questions you'd like to ask.
Well, right away, you think about jazz, you think about modern dance, you think about all the arts forms, opera. I mean, there's plenty of examples of that, I think. And but jazz in particular, I think, Todd, you've done some studies on gospel music and Harlem Renaissance, and there's even today, if you go to a jazz club, there's certainly musicians from the urban areas of America, but a lot of them are European, and a lot of them are Japanese, and it's a completely international stage, and who knows what they believe or not believe, but they're creating music, and so I think that's what, cultural estuary certainly looks like, So.
I'm a young pastor in Rockford, Illinois, after a rather contentious ecumenical volleyball game between our church and the Catholic Church. And one of the Catholic churches. And afterwards, the youth pastor from the other Catholic churches, a friend of mine, he says, well, we should do something to overcome the tension that's been created. And he says, maybe we could pray together. And so one of the students from the Catholic Church, high school student, says, I'll pray, and said, in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. And I said, amen, let's go with that blessing. And he was so offended because that was the way he begins his prayers. The irony is I went on to Notre Dame. But anyway, but I think just the idea that we don't know other people's traditions, and we assume that their tradition is our tradition, and what they do and what they mean by it is the same thing we mean by it, and it can create real hurt feelings. Now, I think the student and I later got together and laughed about it, but at the time, it was not a pleasant situation for anybody. It didn't throw water on the fire. And I think too often, we don't take the time to think about how we presume what other people mean when they do things. And I think that's, whether it's in art or speech or whatever, I think there's a whole lot of presumption going on in our culture right now that we just need to put the brakes on.
I feel like I need you to ask the question again.
Can you actually tell us what you've done in your class? Because I think that's so interesting. Your ideas are very inspiring, charged. They feel maybe new for some of us. And so sometimes the showing, it helps us see what you mean. And I think some of the things you've done in your class or your book, I think it'd be great to hear some of the stories that you have that embodied the idea.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know why. It's personality. I didn't get to sit with Ian Crone this last week, but he would have told me why this is. I'm a three-wing four, so maybe that's the explanation. But I think what it goes back to is this weird sense of calling. For me, first it starts with me, and then my immediate sort of family, and then my family being the community of God in the world. And I've never been able, just personally, this doesn't mean this is everybody's goal, I end up serving as, to quote Morpheus, as the splinter in the mind, right? Like I end up, for whatever reason, in the church context I've served in, even the for-profit organizations I've been in a seminary context, I generally, for some reason, am drawn to those things that sort of provoke and disturb and agitate. But I say that because it starts with me. Like, I'm an incredibly fraught person. Some colleagues, when I think a couple years ago, I taught the class that was called The Aesthetics of Atheism, and that's where this stuff came from. And people were like, are you teaching people how to be an atheist? And I'm like, well, I think maybe. And then by week 10, I have an altar call and everybody gets saved, right? That's what happens. But I'm joking. I'm totally joking. But I say that because when I go to the biblical text, when I go to worship, what we're talking about this morning, when I see the urban doxology, I can't unsee that. And I see my preaching, my writing, and everything really as my sort of artistic endeavor. And the art that compels me is stuff that disturbs me in that good way, that animates me, and so that's part of how I've always envisioned my theological writing, my work in the church, and then my art. I'm more just a creative type. I'm a crafter. But that's sort of, to communicate that's really hard by just talking about it. The best story probably that I can give is a good friend of mine, had just come out to me as a gay man and an atheist. And I can't quite remember exactly which came first. But I actually think him admitting he was an atheist to me was the hardest part of that. And we'd been friends for a while. And he came to Sundance with us because I taught this class, and he saw a film. It was a Jesus film, and by a person that was an outspoken Christian, and saying a lot of things about not hiding behind the name Christian to make bad art, right? And then here's this great example. And my atheist friend was just angry. I mean, he walked away mad, and he's like, how can you associate with this, right? And so we talked a lot, and we're in line for another movie. And I eventually kind of said, I can't be too critical of Christian art. It's easy to do that because I don't think I could do any better. And he looks at me, and this is my atheist friend, and I'm saying I can't do better than tell this Jesus story. And he goes, yes, you can. And I was like, oh. So from there, the next 2 years, my atheist friend and I worked on a screenplay of the life of Jesus. So I can't articulate why that was meaningful for both of us and why it ended up being Jesus, other than to say you need to go read the screenplay. It didn't get made, of course, but you need to go read it because it has all that sort of tension that you don't get in most artistic depictions of the life of Jesus, but you do when an atheist and a Christian get together and write about it. So just time and again, I see these things where I'm probably just incapable of articulating it without some other medium at our disposal.
Any questions? Yes, sir, right there. I see that hand.
My question is how much the political correctness limits you to bring the message in a non-Christian stage?
Is that for you? Is that for one of us or for Mako?
Can you repeat the question? What was the political correctness?
How the political correctness limits your the message of Jesus when you are not a Christian stage.
Okay.
So how the political correctness limits?
Yeah.
Or eliminates?
What we can do or not.
Okay, yeah. So that I have spent the last 20 years thinking about this because as an artist, you're always conscripted to the front lines of culture wars. Either side, conservative, liberal, and you're supposed to be filled with messages to support this agenda. And as an artist, I can say for sure that is the last thing I want to do. So I am not a person, first of all, my personality doesn't lend itself to that, but as an artist, I'm not interested in this reductionistic idea of narrowing my message to a one single message, right? I'm doing the opposite. I am pushing it so that it is the example of generativity and diversity out of my work, which even my intentions may grow into something else entirely. So as a communicator, you're trying to intentionally break that paradigm of what you're talking about, political correctness, with this polarized, categorical identity politics that we play into. And of course, social media, the data that, social media is gathering is predicated upon those categories. So the more whatever you think of social media, I always tell people, don't play into that. It's just going to get worse, and instead, broadcast, use your power as a, social media person, you are your own media. Use that power to broadcast beauty and mercy. Break the data. My son is a boutique web designer. He's a statistical math genius. He creates algorithms to gather data. Okay? He says the way to break this, if you're going to Weather Channel, just look at all the cities. Every time you look at your own city, look at the other cities because they can't figure you out, and then they give up. Well, I don't know if that's still true. It's been a few years since he told me that. But, beauty is is immediately, it pushes the data into this diversified realm that machines cannot handle. Okay, and mercy breaks the paradigm of expectations. If you're ministering to the homeless, if you're ministering to the disadvantaged, you are automatically stepping out of that zone of marketable, data-driven chunks that plays into this ideological divide, this polarized divide. So artists is the antidote, right? So I say cultural care is a nonviolent resistance to culture wars. And I mean that seriously because culture wars will lead to real wars. And we have to have artists as leaders step up and persist in this civil rights movement of culture care.
You know, the topic of political correctness is a broad one, so I could narrow it just a moment and say, how do we proclaim the gospel in a pluralistic society, in a pluralistic world where we assume a neutrality among opinions? If that's the context of political correctness, then the Apostle Paul acknowledges that when he says there's this scandal of the cross and Jesus Christ crucified and the particularity of that. So as Christians, we have the tension between a God who loves everyone and the particularity of the expression of that love in its fullest extent in Jesus Christ. So I think that the challenge is striking that balance where you don't bludgeon people with the particularity, but neither do you hide it under the universality of God's love. And I think that's the tension we have today because on the one hand, we have churches that do a whole lot of good things in speech and in deed, but have lost their particular flavor of the cross. And on the other hand, we've got people who have the cross and use it like a hammer to beat people. And we're right and you're wrong. And I think both ends are more common than not, unfortunately.
Let me ask a question from the online sphere. Somebody's asking a question about the difference, it's not the difference, sort of the distinction between the intent of the artist or the intent of the work and the result or impact, and that often it becomes contradictory to the other. The way people receive it, experience it, is opposite to how it was intended. And it seems to me that this is especially the case on the public square, in the marketplace. Like what we did here with Julie in this space had a context. There was a kind of explanation. There was an invitation, and it had been preceded by many other things. If the kneeling, which almost universally is a positive gesture, whereas sitting can be laden with lots of negative connotations, but a kneeling thing that was intended one way was received in the opposite by half of this country. Your explanation, Todd, was immensely helpful, but not everybody gets that explanation. So how would you all help us think through, let's say those of us who are engaged in the public square, who are putting things out into the public, ether of sorts, we have an intention. What do we do with impacts or results or responses that may be exactly the opposite and may lead to further divides? And there are a range of answers, but I would love to hear your all's thoughts on that. And if you can be concrete, like maybe with something that comes to mind.
Yeah, I mean, my first thought is, well, I don't know. It'd be interesting to hear what Mako says about this. Because, again, when I call myself an artist, it's just, I feel silly when you're next to me. So, but my art, but honestly, I've always thought of, when I was preaching regularly, of preaching as an art. Like it was public rhetoric, and and so it skewed towards the poetic. I would do stuff like this, and people walk away and they're like, "What just happened, Cutter? Like we came in, you're supposed to preach. That was not preaching, right?" But as I've got better at trying to bridge the divide, between my artistic instincts and communicating. I've drawn upon stories, metaphors, and whatnot. And what's interesting is I go, oh, well, that's what Jesus did, right? Jesus told stories. Very, very, very rarely does Jesus explain anything to anyone. In fact, it's the opposite. The only people he does is to the disciples, and they still don't get it. They're like, wait, what? This still doesn't make any sense. But he kept doing it. And the record we've got must be kept because he told them over and over and over and over again. And how many different interpretations of the mustard seed do you think there are? Infinite. And how frustrating do you think Jesus was when he heard some guy down in Galilee says that the mustard seed really isn't the smallest of all mustard, something like that. So I had this, this is off the cuff, Cutter, that's bad. But I was preaching this once, I had this wonderful metaphor, perfect, it's captivating, it's stimulating, whatever. And then after the service, people are, oh, thank you, whatever. And this woman comes up, and it's my own congregation, my own church, and she goes, oh, Cutter, thank you. That metaphor was perfect. Now I know why all of my Hollywood friends are atheists. I'm like, wait, what? And I'm like, that is not even, and I felt myself all of a sudden trying to control my metaphor. Like control, no. Let me tell you the right interpretation of this. Let me tell you how this is supposed to function in your life. And I had to stop myself because I go, if I'm going to actually honor the value of what art brings, what symbol, what metaphor, what visuals give, and that's this plurality. Not anything is on the table, but there is a sort of a texture to it. I have to be okay with both. And so there's this sort of like intention of the artist to be misunderstood is part of the task. Right now it's hard because we have the data to show how many people are mad at you for being misunderstood. Whereas before you didn't, right? And now it's like you have 3,000 people angry, And I think that's the difference, but I see that as sort of the task, as you lean into it and you're going to be misunderstood at a certain level. And at that point is when you have to say, I'm not going to overly prescribe what I've created.
So Carter and I had a privilege of interviewing Martin Scorsese here at Fuller. You can see the interview by Fuller Studio. And Martin Scorsese famously is a poster child of culture wars for the Last Temptation of Christ film that came out in early 90s. And literally there were boycotts. In my church, missionary church in Japan, they were passing out the signature to boycott this film. And I later found out that he was in Japan at the time because he was in Kurosawa's, film Dream, in which he plays Vincent van Gogh, riding on a bullet train, reading Silence. Okay, so here's a direct answer. He did not intend to start culture wars. We've spoken to him. That was the last thing he wanted. He was simply asking. He said, these questions we were asking in East Village, seminary, together as Catholic seminarians. Why are these people upset? And I guess I made a mistake making it into a film. And I think his answer to that was silence. Mm-hmm. Creating a movie that is so difficult for Hollywood to understand, rejected by Hollywood in a way. But when it was released in Japan, the first 10 days, 300,000 Japanese lined up to see it, despite 2 pastors protesting, telling their people not to see it. So there's something about art, the complexity at the master's level, that does trigger something, but it also mediates at the same time. And if you're willing to go deeper, Carter and I were at Sundance watching many films, but there are so many films that speak into this divide, because no matter where you are on the spectrum of political correctness or faith, projections, you end up asking these questions, and when you create, when we sang that song together, you don't need to agree with each other. You can still create beauty.
The question took me in a different direction, and that is, how do we sort of close the loop on miscommunication. And I think the context in which we're in now, historically, is a fascinating one. It's not a new book now, but Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death describes the shift from the technology of the printing press, in which you can distribute a great deal of detailed information over a broad distance, but slowly, because it takes time to physically transport a book, to telegraphy, that is the telegraph, where you can transport a short amount of information almost instantaneously, and that we've chosen to value that. And therefore, we've taken speed over quantity and quality, and then goes on to say, and when you add video, radiography or radio, and then television, in all of those things, you're creating entertainment mediums, which means the information not only has to be sound bites, it has to be tantalizing and titillating sound bites to hold people's attention, because there's other things competing for it. And I think we have to step back and say, this is a context in the last 100 years that's new to humanity. This whole electronic media, where we have more access with more information from more people than we've ever had before, and no one filtering it. And I think all those things make us step back and say, we need to think about how we have been shaped by this culture, for better or for worse, in ways that we think about information and communication that we didn't before.
You know, it makes me think, too, I have a man crush on Jaron Lanier, if anybody know him. He wrote 10 Arguments for Why You Should Delete All Your Social Media Accounts Immediately. But he would actually say it is filtered. The other additional thing now is, currently in our sort of mediated context, the sort of scintillating stuff that started before is now, in fact, how the algorithms are written. And the moneyed interests know that, and that's where the advertising dollars go. So Lanier it's a great book, but one of the really interesting things is then he says, because of that, his argument is, and he's not a person of faith or anything that I know of, says what this has created is a world that is incapable of empathy. And the reason is because now my Facebook feed or Twitter feed or whatever literally is uninhabitable by anyone else. It's customized to my hates and my likes, my friends, my enemies, in a way that no one can see. And if empathy hinges upon me inhabiting the worldview of someone else, even if for a moment, it actually prevents us from doing that. So the filtering is happening. It's just completely unaware of us, or we're aware of it, we don't care, we sign the acceptance agreement just without thinking, right? So part of it is, I think that's the other challenge, especially with art too, of we're actually under these systems, these principles and powers that extend beyond human agency, that are actually powerfully affecting how we have these conversations and being able to empathize.
Yes, a question here. If there are any other hands, maybe I'll just go ahead and account for them. No, I know. I'm just saying, if anybody else, we have maybe about 8 minutes. So if you would like to ask a question, I see a hand there. No, I see you. I'm just saying, in addition to this fine gentleman, I might just go ahead and take an accounting.
Oh my.
Okay, fine. We'll start with you. Good sir.
The fine gentleman here. Okay, I have an interesting practical question. I'm part of the Westmont College community, and some of us here are from there. And we had Philip Yancey with us yesterday. And you came up in chapel, Mako. So Philip's talking, and he's talking about visiting Shane Claiborne. And he's talking about, and this is in the context of a chapel speech about things that he hasn't figured out yet. So he's telling us things he hasn't figured out. And I'm not sure if I was totally tracking with him, but he was talking about Shane Claiborne's very simple lifestyle. And then he talked about those people who are writing about thriving in abundance and things like that. And I think you came up, Miroslav Wolf, and T. Wright were some of the names that I remember he mentioned. So here's where it gets practical for me as I'm thinking about the value of the arts and things like simplicity. I'm turning 30 next month, and I have this big idea. Yeah, I'll have Julie's hosting a birthday party out here for me. And Eric. And one of my ideas is to do a GoFundMe and ask 100 people to give me $30 so that I can buy this sweet Nord keyboard. But I'm really torn about it right now because I also could feels like a lot of money to spend on myself. And I care about the arts, though, and this keyboard would make me really happy. And there's things going on in my life that make life less happy, and so I wonder if that would be a good thing. But just to Philip Yancey's question, and maybe speaking to other artists who are kind of wrestling with themes of abundance, themes of like economics and stuff like that, any practical counsel, or just a story or an idea, or $3,000 for a keyboard, whatever.
So is the question about whether I should choose Shane Claiborne's route of simplicity and a vow of poverty, kind of that line, or whether there's a place for abundance? Is that the question? I just want to make sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think the real question is, how would somebody respond pastorally to my inner turmoil about spending $3,000 on a keyboard for myself? Wanting to honor these principles of simplicity and charity, but also like, the arts are a real good thing in the world, and this could be valuable.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mako, I'll let you.
So, yeah, thank you. So my quick question, my quick answer to that is that you have a wonderful community around you. And this is not a question about you only, but it's about your community. Okay? So you don't have to answer that question. Let your community answer that question. Now, on the other hand, I know Shane. I have deep respect and admiration for who he is, and I have no doubt that his decisions are, made because of his calling, because of who he is, because of how God has created him. And I can learn a lot from him. But even he would agree that God's gospel is abundant. That's the baseline. That's where we have to start from. Because Jesus' answer to the disgruntled disciples who didn't want Mary to break that nard, the expensive nard, extravagant nard, $50,000 nard. And the disciple, probably was Judas, said, how can... Well, it was probably everybody, every disciple, right? Everybody was thinking the same thing.
It was Matthew, the tax collector.
Yeah, the tax collector. Yeah, it was everybody. Was saying, how can you be so wasteful? How can you waste? We could have sold that and fed the poor, which is a line that I hear as an artist all the time. Mm-hmm. Because I'm constantly buying pigments and gold, and I want to do a painting about that experiment, rather for the experiment, because it's like walking on water. Like, why do you do this when people are starving, right? So we should have a conversation about that. I want to collaborate with you because I think you're an amazing musician. I think this this world of abundance is not in spite or in lieu of scarcity. If you really understand abundance, you realize how scarce we are, even if we had $1 zillion and we could buy all the keyboards in the world. That's not the question, So I think it's a way of asking that really restores us to the vision of abundance that Jesus had for everyone as he spoke when they had nothing, right? And his vision is generous, extravagant, and so I think as we follow Jesus, we ought to carry that message with us, and the way we carry that out may be different for each one of us.
Okay, we have time for one more. Mako, that was almost an Oprah moment. Everybody gets Mako to collaborate with them. I offer Mako to each of you. No, just the fine gentleman over there. Okay, one more question. Yes, ma'am.
My question refers back to the young woman who led us in that wonderful exercise and gave us that very powerful introduction.
Okay.
As a middle-aged white woman, I really want to be stretched and learn more about different perspectives. And so if you have any practical tips or suggestions on how I can find places to be exposed to those voices and images that my brothers and sisters who aren't white might be expressing, and where I can tap into those resources.
I see Ed doing the same thing that I'm going to do, which is Julie. We're going to have you come down. You can answer that.
Should I stay here?
No, Julie, come with us.
Come
Okay.
on down.
Have a seat.
The coveted Tabasco seat. Thank you for asking the question. I think just the fact that you're taking a posture of learning and keeping your heart open to be taught is already the right start. I think the practical ways that that have helped me even to colonize my worship has been to make sure that my mentorship is by people of color and different backgrounds, gender, experiences, stories. The authors that I'm reading, so my bookshelf, to also embody that as well. To be in community, often one of the things that happens to me a lot is that I'm invited to a lot of meetings and in conversations sometimes like this to talk about and relive sometimes my own trauma over and over and over again, and yet I'm never ever invited to dinner in your home. And that's a problem, because even in that, you're tokenizing my story and my voice. But I'm not important enough. I'm not somebody that you're willing to be uncomfortable with enough that you would invite me to your dinner table to eat and dine with you. I think those are things that I think about a lot in the relationships that I have with people of color and with white people. I just think if we're going to do this well, we need to be able to invite people to dinner. Yeah, I don't want to just I don't want to just be somebody that makes you feel great about checking off the boxes, but let me into the life and the living and the breathing. Let me make you uncomfortable, and then let's move to a place where we can get comfortable. We need to address those things in that way. So my expectation is I'll be getting an invitation from all of y'all after this to dinner, okay? I love food. It's a great way to get me in. But I hope that's a good starting point.
By the way, she is a foodie, so if you ever want a restaurant recommendation in LA, that's the person.
I'm an LA born and raised, so I know this area pretty well. But yes, now I'm going to go away.
Oh. Can I say one thing too, David? I
No,
think
you may not.
it's a very helpful question. Oh, I can't?
No, I'm just kidding.
Well, because I think I know. I want to say it because I'm a white male. That's why I want to say this. Dia, what's the phrase? Oh, you're recording. You don't know. I was riffing with Dia at Sundance, and I was like, "Tell me if this is right." And I had a conversation with another white male about something. That's all I'll say. And I was like, "I think you don't know what's going on here, and I don't know why I can see what's happening and you can't. But let me step aside." And the person who was not a white male that was being harmed by that, we need to let her go, and you and I need to talk. And seriously. And I had to say, I can only say this to you as a white male because I'm right there with you and I have as many problems as you do. I can't keep letting the people that have been traumatized be the ones that are teaching me how to be better. I don't yet know exactly what that looks like because I still want a diversity of voices around me. But I do think there's something where those of us who come from and have inherited a certain kind of privilege that we need to do the work ourselves first, and then only. So the invitation to a meal is really interesting. Shameless plug. Go check out Cutter Calloway's Progressive TV Dinner, which is just the latest episode. But I did this podcast series with a group of women of color, and what we did was we each hosted a meal. And we went to each other's houses, and we talked about a Canadian TV show. I mean, that's what it was. But it was transformative because we each got to host and invite people in, and then we hosted others in our spaces. And I realized in that that part of the challenge is not just, who's, if we're using the metaphor of the table, often we say, well, I'll invite a Julie to my table, right? That's interesting. But we also need to become the kind of people that would be invitable to her table. And right now, I'm not. And that's part of I think the deeper work that we need to do as well. In addition to saying, Julie, now, what kind of steak do you like? Or tartare? I don't know. So that's...
I don't discriminate when it
okay.
comes to steaks. I'll receive it all.
Any steak, okay, good.
If I may, when you start filing through things that will be memorable from today, one of them will probably be that map that David Bailey provided for us. And we have to revision the way people are organized. And it may begin by saying, my community of faith needs to find a sister or brother community of faith in another part of the world, and we need to have ongoing conversations about ministry in each other's worlds so that we can understand each other. And I think, many cities have sister cities somewhere else in the world. We should have sister congregations, brother congregations, where we're stretching ourselves because we're hearing about worlds we really don't feel comfortable in. But we need that because those are our sisters and brothers.
And I think part of the problem of how we got here in the first place is because our churches seem to only gather people that agree with us. And we have no tolerance for the possibility of someone that might disagree with us. We don't know how to make relationship and love well our neighbors that maybe we don't see the world the same way. And we just keep pushing them out until only the people that agree with us remain in our churches. And then you don't need to decolonize worship. You don't have to do any work at all. Everyone's in agreement. And then worship becomes this thing that doesn't get to disrupt our lives and ask us to change and reshape.
Thank you, dear friends. We will convene at the top of the hour, 4 o'clock, so you have 15 minutes to get some really good coffee out there, chat with each other, use the restroom. We'll see you in 15 minutes. 3. All right. Hello, testing, testing, testing. Testing, testing. Testing. There you go. All right, if we can invite you to find your seat, we're going to get ready for our last session. Dear AV people, could we get on the screen that text for the resources? Is that doable? I just want to make sure yeah, there we go. Let me just make a few housekeeping announcements before we get started. But before I do the housekeeping, I just want to thank you again for coming, for traveling, for choosing to spend your Saturday with us. I realize for some of you that has meant leaving family behind or children or finding childcare or responsibilities that you've had to entrust to other people. So thank you for making those decisions to be with us. Thank you for spending money to be with us. We don't take that for granted. And I hope one of the things that you will take away from this conference, which is a geyser of information, admittedly because it's a conference, but I hope one of the things you really take with you maybe a year from now, that you'll remember that when we talk about things that divide us and unite us, at the end of the day, the one thing that will be most common to the suggestions and ideas and practices that unite us are the relational ones, are the relational and intentional and intensive experiences and decisions that we make to be together. So in whatever way that we are together here, even if we're mostly in a dark room, I thank you and I ask God to forge some kind of relational connection with one another here in this space. Again, all the presenters have created handouts. They're really quite wonderful. I hope you take advantage of them. You can text that number. They will be distributed to you within the week. Some folks have asked me about the presentations themselves. They will be on the fuller.edu/watch page, I think for about a month. So if you want to rewatch them, or I guess watch them with somebody else, you can. After that, they will shift to Fuller Studios' YouTube page. And I know some of you are wondering if you get images and presentations, you probably won't be able to get the PowerPoints, but you can watch the whole presentation on your computer, and I guess you can take a still shot if you wish. So those will be available to you. You can share them with your friends and community back home. All right, those are housekeeping. Let me introduce our last two speakers. And our theme here is Walls That Bind Together. And our two speakers are Shannon Sigler and Maria Fee. So let me introduce them. And then I'm actually going to introduce somebody who's going to lead us in a visual experience. The fancy Latin term is Visio Divina, and that's Dia. Is that what it is? Visio? Yeah, Visio. Yeah, it's also, I guess it's divine. Is it divine? Yes, it is Visio Divina. Good. And that'll be Dia, and I'll introduce her briefly before she comes up. But our two speakers, Shannon Sigler is a visual artist and theologian and the executive director of Brehm Cascadia in Seattle, Washington. And she has also planned conferences extraordinarily well with Christians in the visual arts and through the Brehm Cascadia. She is an extraordinarily talented, capable person, has a passion for pastoring artists and building bridges between art and the church. She's also a visual artist herself. I've seen her work. It's quite extraordinary. And she is a parent to a creative 7-year-old and a wife to a liturgical theologian, both of whom I know and like very much. Our second speaker is Maria Fee, and she is an adjunct professor of theology and culture here at Fuller Seminary. She's a visual artist, and I have also seen her work. She has an MFA in painting, and it's extraordinary as well. And she is a lead faculty for the Theology and Arts Capstone course, about which I have heard only rave reviews of how she leads and teaches that course. Maria brings to the Brehm Center expertise in theology and the arts, the visual arts and liturgical expression. artistic creation as spiritual formation. I first met Maria when she was arts ministry coordinator for the Center for Faith and Work at Redeemer Presbyterian in New York City, and met her husband, Brian, and my wife and I, Phaedra, have loved them ever since. Her artwork itself explores ideas of fragmentation, mestizaje, alienation, and hospitality. And she will be our second speaker. Let me introduce now Dia Jenkins, who has been an MAT and MAICS student here at Fuller. She's also a Fujimura Fellow, and she's from my hometown, Houston, Texas. Please, Dia.
What can an afro and a cheap pal say together? Today, I am wearing a Chinese-style dress featuring the artwork of a dear friend of mine, Beijing artist Shuling Gu. Though we've been friends for years, Shuling still laughs at my American way of pronouncing her name. Our dialogues have produced a rather eccentric rhythm as we both stumble through one another's native languages. Time and again, art has proven to be a resting place for us, a meeting grounds of sorts, where each person stands ready to receive what the other has to offer. Art has made a way for our friendship to flourish across time, distance, and language barriers. Today, we invite you to participate in an exercise called Visio Divina as we reflect on being a part of God's creation. As you enter into this process, consider where all that you are hearing today meets the ground. Where are the cultural bridges that you can cross within your communities? What names and faces come to mind as you consider how art and art making can bridge cultural divides? For those of you who have practiced Lectio Divina, Visio Divina is a familiar process. Visio Divina invites us to enter into divine encounter through art or other images. Throughout the day, you've been able to see the painting on my left by Eric Tai from near and far, from different angles and with various strengths of light. I will read a scripture, and as you listen, allow God to prompt you with words, images, prayers, names, and faces as you once again observe the work. After the scripture is read, a short piece of music will be heard. Use that time to close your eyes and reflect or pray as you wish. Following the music, we will be led in a corporate prayer, a prayer for creativity. Please remember, there is no right or wrong way to pray or meditate. I invite you to close your eyes for a moment. Take a few deep centering breaths. Invite God to enter into this time of reflection and quietness with you. As the scripture is read, you can look at the painting and notice as a word, emotion, prayer, face, or name comes to your mind. You can keep your eyes closed if you like, or you can take a look at the painting. Psalm 8. Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory in the heavens. Through the praise of children and infants, you have established a stronghold against your enemies to silence the foe and the avenger. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is mankind that you are mindful of them? Human beings that you care for them. You have made them a little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honor. You made them rulers over the works of your hands. You put everything under their feet, all flocks and herds, and the animals of the wild, the birds in the sky, and the fish in the sea, all that swim the paths of the seas. Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. I invite you now to continue to pray and meditate as the music is played.
Made by you, imagined by you, formed in your image, created by your love. We often forget that we are creatures of imaginative potential, of creativity. That our imaginations, like yours, can be generative and life-giving, useful to your kingdom.
We often forget that our assumptions about you are limited by our experience here, by words on a page, by culture and tradition, by our ego, by our smallness. But with these starting points and with imagination, we can let go of assuming and move closer to you.
We struggle because we only know things that you are like water, like bread, like wind, like a parent, like a king. But
we know that these are incomplete comparisons. Nothing we know can define you. We pause now and open our minds to the fullness of God, of which we can contain only a little at a time, a portion that gives us life, and makes us hungry and thirsty for more, fueling our imaginations.
This is what we ask for, to be able to move past what we can see, feel, taste, touch, and hear with our mortal bodies toward a new horizon, a new reality.
A kingdom you are imagining and inviting us to imagine and embody. Amen.
It's really amazing when the Lord gives you the absolute perfect setup. So thank you for that. And as David said, I have planned many a conference. I love planning conferences, and I am thrilled that so many of you are still here for the 4 o'clock slot. Thank you for staying around for the denouement after we went through the conflict. So thanks. I want to start out with a question. And my question for you is, what is hospitality? It's become a loaded word in our culture. It's become a politicized word. It's become a word that has so much meaning that it has no meaning at all. And we all probably have different perceptions. Is this hospitality? Yes. Yes. So I am from the South. I'm from Louisiana, and baked goods are my love language. And right now, I am also not eating them. So I've been like speculating on what she has in those little pies, and I'm pretty sure it's peaches. I don't know. Is this hospitality? A country club set up for a wedding or whatever you can imagine that this might be, with a monogrammed logo on the wine glass. Is this hospitality? I vote no. In the Pacific Northwest, we're a culture of removing your shoes. So if you go to someone's house, they always ask you to remove your shoes. And I'm thinking, I like these boots. They go with this outfit. I really don't want to take them off, and my feet will be cold. I respect those of you who are shoe removers, who have beautiful carpets. You don't want to get ruined, but I don't know if this is hospitality. Is this hospitality? Church greeters. Some churches have entire ministries built around greeting people when you come to the door. And next, is this hospitality? This is my very favorite depiction of the Annunciation, painted by Henry Osawa Tanner in 1898. I love how visceral it is. We know that Mary says, "Let it be to me as you have said," but her face is like, what the HE double hockey sticks is going on right now? She's terrified, but there's also an element of peace and an element of calm and an element of openness. So what is hospitality? I have the privilege each year of working with a group of 5 artists and 5 churches from across the Pacific Northwest, all the way up from Vancouver, BC, down to Portland. We pair artists and churches together for a year-long program called the Cascadia Residency. And in this residency, we explore theology and the arts together. We explore the identity of the artist. And then we explore the reconciliation between artist and church. And some folks are really uncomfortable with me using the word reconciliation about artists, but I actually think we have a real opportunity if we can bridge this gap. Artists have felt alienated from the church for years for many reasons that I don't have time to go into right now. But this is our cohort from 2017. This cohort included a 3D designer from Nike, a young adult fiction writer, an opera singer, a textile artist, and a pastel artist. A really diverse group of mediums. And every year, our very first retreat, we start with the question, what is hospitality? And then we brainstorm and we put it on a whiteboard, because that's what you do. And I was struck that each year, we've done this 3 years now, the primary theme that surfaces when we talk about a group of artists, we talk with a group of artists about hospitality, is creating space. Creating space. It's not about cookies. It's not about greeters. It's not about taking off your shoes. It's about making space for the other. So with this idea of creating space, I started asking myself, why do the artists always come up with the same thing? And it makes sense that a group of artists might understand hospitality this way. If you think about it, in a painting, it's negative space that helps the viewer make sense of a composition. It is pause in a musical piece that allows rhythm to flourish in a meaningful way. And for goodness sakes, what do artists covet more than anything else? Anybody know? Studio space, right? It's studio space. So it's confession time. I am a faithful Wesleyan, and I've been with Fuller for 4 years, and I'm usually surrounded by lots of Calvinists, so go with me here. This is a portion of a hymn written by the more creative of the Wesley brothers, Charles Wesley. I love both of them, but I'm partial to Charles. Let earth and heaven combine, angels and men agree, to praise in songs divine the incarnate deity. Our God contracted to a span, incomprehensibly made man. Does anybody know what a span is? So at that time period, a span was considered the length of a human hand. This is not a large space. And imagining the Godhead being contracted to a span. One of my favorite authors, Madeleine L'Engle, says, the virgin birth has never been a major stumbling block in my struggle with Christianity. It's far less mind-boggling than the power of all creation stooping so low as to become one of us. The Godhead contracted. I think that word is intentional, to a span. Mary chose to make space. When speaking literally, to create space, you shrink or remove something else. Hospitality, creating space. So my next question for you is this: how can artists help us create space in our church communities? The scholar David Bentley Hart talks about beauty as an expanse, as an empty space between what is now and what is to come, a space for longing, mystery, lament, or other strong emotions and desires. It's often the case that our churches are not good at holding this kind of space. We move quickly away from discomfort of ambiguity, intense emotion, or silence to get to the point of your 5-point sermon. We fear questions with no answers. But as Cutter said earlier, it's good to remember that Jesus taught with more questions than answers. He spoke in parables, and he instructed with art. So the first type of space that artists create in our communities is inquisitive space, understanding beauty as an expanse between the already and the not yet. At this point in our nation's history, our worship need not be merely didactic. I would argue that we cannot continue to go without the experience of mystery, affection, or longing in our communities. The people of God need a safe space to work out the empty space between the reality of the world as we know it and the joy of the coming kingdom. Artists can hold this space if we let them. I keep thinking about atoms being mostly empty space and how terrifying that would feel, and what an amazing presentation that was earlier. Artists can help us hold this space. One of the biggest barriers to the artist-church relationship, I think, is a language barrier. It's often the case that when two artists are having a conversation, they discuss ideas of beauty and art in completely different ways than they would with another member of the congregation. The opposite is also true. In the church, we tend to talk about beauty in hyper-abstract theological terms like glory, majesty, or even, gasp, sovereignty. Deborah Sokolov, an artist and theologian from Wesley Seminary, attempts to redefine beauty as a relational space. This is another type of space that artists can help us hold. Rather than leaning into a definition of beauty that is inaccessible, she roots this concept in the Trinity and talks about beauty as a way of relating to one another. The space between an individual and the other, whether human or divine, becomes an opportunity to cultivate beauty. Artists can help us cultivate those in-between spaces that are sometimes difficult in the church. I believe that when artists are attuned to the culture, needs, and personalities of their individual congregations, they create work that generates dynamism and relationship. Their work becomes a gift and not an act of egoism. So go with me with this quote that's way too long for this slide. I apologize. This is Athanasius. "The Lord did not come to make a display. He came to heal and to teach suffering men. For one who wanted to make a display, the thing would have been to just appear and dazzle the beholders." Do you know artists like this? "But for him who came to heal and to teach the way was not merely to dwell here, but to put himself at the disposal of those who needed him, and to be manifested according as they could bear it, not vitiating the value of the divine appearing by exceeding their capacity to receive it." So when artists are guided by the Spirit, when artists view their work as a gift, they are not going to exceed the viewer's capacity to receive it. This is not art for art's sake. This is art for the sake of the other. In contrast, a quote from Lewis Hyde in his iconic book, The Gift: But when you give a gift, there is momentum, and the weight shifts from body to body. I love this quote. I love that it's visceral. I love that it's human. I love that it's incarnate. But I'm not going to leave you there. Hospitality goes both ways. We're called to submit to one another. In considering spaces of mutuality, how can the church create space for artists? The first way, I believe, is liturgical space. The liturgy creates space if we submit to the story of God. This may seem counterintuitive. Don't artists hate restrictions? But the liturgy need not be understood as restrictive. I've seen it over and over again. When artists and congregations engage the rhythm of the story of God, these boundaries empower freedom. They empower collaboration. They empower creativity. Submission to a historic narrative that we did not create ourselves is a powerful way to make room for the other, both divine and human. Another way that we as church leaders can create space for artists is to know your artists. Since my childhood, I have considered myself an artist in some capacity. And every time I would enter a new church community and someone found out that I was an artist, I would immediately be asked to paint a backdrop for VBS, to create an Advent banner, fill in the blank. So I'm encouraging you to know your artists and not just their gifts. Relationships require space. Submit to one another. Make time to know your artists, their hearts, their struggles, not just their gifts. Go to their shows, buy them dinner, understand their practices and rhythms. What sacrifices do they make for their art? And then thirdly, predictably again, studios. Do you have an extra Sunday school classroom? Do you have a garage? This gift of space is invaluable for an artist. A final type of space that's absolutely necessary to create this mutuality in the church is sacrificial space. And I actually probably should not consider it a separate type because everything I've talked about today requires sacrifice. We must all become smaller. Creating spaces of mutuality in the church is a sacrifice for artists and congregations, but a sacrifice that has the potential to cultivate beauty, generativity, healing, relationship, and most of all, authentic worship. We together create space for the triune God to enter in. So I'm going to finish with another Wesley song. We're going to have the lyrics up here for you. They're powerful. There's a lot of contrast, a lot of metaphor. And I would ask you to just experience this song as a prayer, and then we'll close.
To God on high, and peace on earth descend. God comes down, he bows the sky, he shows himself our friend. God the invisible appears, God the blessed, the great I am, sojourns in this vale of tears, and Jesus is his name. Him the angels all adored, their maker and their king. Tidings of their humble Lord they now to mortals bring. Emptied of his majesty, of his dazzling glory shorn, being cease begins to be, and God himself is born. of man, dwelling in an earthly cloud, whom heaven cannot contain. Stand amazed, ye heavens, at this. 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 See the Lord of earth and skies. Humble to the dust he is, and in a manger lies. We sons and daughters of men rejoice, the Prince of Peace proclaim. With heaven's host lift up our voice and shout Emmanuel's name. Knees and hearts to him we bow, of our flesh and of our bone. Jesus is our brother now, and God is all our own. God is all our own, all our own.
Amen. Being source begins to be, and God himself is born. Church, let's make space for our artists and allow our artists to open up spaces of mutuality that our communities desperately need. Amen.
Hello? Hello? Do I have to do something to this? I'm good? Okay. Theological institution, will you make room for the artist? How do I start this thing? Just press the button. Okay. Thank you, Andrew, coming to my rescue. So, Julie's little social sculpture that we did, that's a Joseph Beuys term, the artist Joseph Beuys, brings to mind a quote from Theaster Gates, who's my dissertation subject. He's an artist that you need to look up if you don't know who he is. He says, let me see if I can get this right. Everybody loves the arts, right? Yeah, we love the arts, but we don't particularly like the artist, right? Like, we like the idea of the arts. We love that idea of the arts, but when the artist asks to sit at the same table with everybody else, we might sit there, but we get asked at the very last moment. So this little talk is not a paper because I was asked as an artist to speak at the very last moment. And so I come to the table late. This is my artwork. First, I would need to do something. Lauralee, can you please stand up? Stand up. Lauralee is the VIP of communications here at Fuller. She is the manager of all the content that she is documenting here. So thank you, Lauralee. This day will live on because of Lauralee and her team. And Lauralee heard me, in her words, rapping at the window, right? And she opened the window, and she let me come into this conversation. So thank you for giving me this platform. You all were expecting to hear her, and she, as a white woman, offered another white woman, but of Hispanic heritage, to an artist to have this platform. So thank you very much. Amen. So this is my artwork. Enough of that. I'm an artist, a theologian, dare I say that. For the last 5 years, I've been adjunct professor here of theology and culture, teaching capstone theology and arts. Any capstone theology and art folk here? Basically, what that is I take in the vein of Joseph Beuys, the artist again that I'm bringing up. His famous dictum is every human being is an artist. So what I do is I take seminarians and I help them to think like an artist. I help them through an artistic discipline as the ground for theological speculation. Amen? So it is in that's my standpoint, and it's, so instead of reading a paper, I'm gonna actually guide you through a very quick drawing as part of discussing what it means to be an artist in a theological institution. Okay, so here, really quick rundown of the drawing. There's two spheres, one is warm, one is cold. They're kind of like just hanging out. And then this other mass comes in. All of a sudden, those two spheres are kind of animated, but so is the whole page. And even though it's kind of like, similar size, it's made of plural. I love circles, and those circles have multiple meanings in my artwork. So anyway, all of a sudden, that interloper begins to generate itself, populate itself, seed itself, and it begins to crowd the interstices and the spaces so much that these three discrete objects become part of a unified mass. Okay, here's the other story that these drawings, another story. The orange is fuller. The blue is, let's say, culture, and that's everything, worship, theology, everything that human beings make, art, film, even our ethnic cultures. And then here is the, wow, it's going off screen. Here is the Brehm Center's vision statement. It is this vision statement that attracts a lot of creatives to a theological institution such as Fuller. And it's because for a lot of these individuals, maybe you're one of them, they have multiple points of intersection between these experiences of culture and them understanding that it has theological heft. And they come to Fuller looking for someone to connect all those multiple points of intersections because they also understand that underneath that there's that it undergirds Christian growth, spiritual formation. So they come here, right? And so basically, even though there's about 3 or 4 stances that this mission statement or vision statement kind of endorses, the one, because it is an academic situation, institute, the major thing that students experience here is the critical integration of worship, theology, and the arts. That's the main thing that happens here, okay? Right, students? Oh, wait, where are you all? That's kind of interesting that there are no Fuller students here. Why is that? Anyway, that's another question. So what happens, now critical thinking, analysis, investigation, however you want to put it, that has multiple modes. But the primary mode in most academic situations is the linear one. An argument of progression. It's detached and distanced so it can be unbiased, right? And so right away, so we do critical analysis of, film or literature, and it's already a step away. We don't enter actually into it. And so what gets skipped for a lot of these folks who understand that in the real world and through what they do in the world, something's happening, that the praxis or the making gets left out of that critical analysis. Okay, you with me? Right. So for instance, here's an example. Since I didn't have time for this talk, I had one afternoon. I had to take all these ideas and I had to draw out my talk. it is not linear. Okay? So actually that little drawing that I went through is that's how I came up. It's through drawing this out, I came up with that drawing, okay? Where am I? Okay, so what do I mean? So here's another way art has this critical mode, meaning it's investigative, it's analytical, it has a component of reflection. And so I'm going to go to my dissertation topic, Theaster Gates, down here. There's 2 things that he's doing here. I'm going to walk them out. The first is that that's his musical ensemble, the Black Monks of Mississippi. The word monks is in there purposefully because what they do is they usher into the white museum space. They usher in the sounds of the spiritual. They kind of infuse the space with the spirit. Okay, number 2. You guys know Theaster Gates? Anybody out there? Okay. Okay, so tell me what that is behind there. What that piece is. Fire hoses, okay. These are his civil rights tapestries made out of decommissioned fire hoses, harkening back to the 1963 hosing of civil rights activists in Birmingham, Alabama. They're beautiful, and they're packed with critique and analysis and commentary. Okay, got it? This is what my students do with their thesis projects. This is the way that my students do theology here at Fuller. Yet they were asked here at the last minute to perform and do their things. Yet I was asked here at the last moment to speak about these things. Because why? Because the artist doesn't have space. There's no space at the table for the artists. How many of you do things for free? How many artists do we have out there? I'm speaking right here. I'm adjunct. I'm doing this for free. I'm not getting a speaker's fee here. Okay. Whew. Okay. So part of this critical mode is a praxis mode. Okay? It's a praxis mode, meaning, so once I became a theologian, I had to read a lot and do a lot of, reading, So because I'm Hispanic American, I did a pretty wide survey of liberation theologies, or what Cornel West calls worldly theologies. Because, and so one of the terms that I love out of Hispanic Latinx theologies is this word conjunto. So you don't do theology outside of your life. It starts with your life. And so a lot of what I do as an artist is based on these liberation theologies or worldly theologies, because you don't separate the praxis from the analytical, critical. They happen together, conjunto. They don't get separated. They fill the interstices. They fill the spaces with operations of making and looking and reflecting. Constant, multiple iterations, so it fills the field. Amen? Fills it. So I'm going to take extra time because I was invited late. And I'm going to go out. I've had a lot of students, and so I just kind of want to point out one of my students, Hyung-Hin Kim, one of her projects that she did, just so to give you a frame of reference of what these theological theses look like. And so Hyung-Yin is Korean-born, Korean family, but she lived in Japan for a big chunk of her life, and then she also immigrated here to the States. So that intersectionality, of these 3 different personalities become symbolic through the image of a braid. And so the first part of her thesis project was through a series of workshops that she works with people of varying ages. She gets to talk about difference and alienation and foreigner and what does it be to be a refugee or to feel different. And so the way she does that is through embodied creating these braids. So people could see that, you pick your braid and then you work in conjunction with another to make this one thing, this one strand. And so the second part of her of her piece becomes a piece that she's shown actually across the country in several galleries already. And it's called Remember Bearing for Refugees. So that's an example of a theological thesis that comes out of Fuller. Those are all the titles that have populated the interstices of theology and art here at Fuller. Sorry, I'm not going to go there. I'm snarky today, but I'm not going to be that snarky. But this is the first year that this class is not being taught. Next year is going to be taught in 10 weeks online. So this is the valuation. Even though we love the arts, this is the only place that seminarians could actually work with their hands and think with their hands is now disappearing. Okay, enough of my snarkiness. We've been talking about walls, and I'm going to end with this image. And we've talked about walls, and we've been deconstructing walls. This is a piece that I made. It was in chapel last year. And it was created with the wall in mind. And so what would it look like in the spirit of Joseph Beuys to invite artists to think about how to reconstruct walls that are flexible, that are permeable, that are porous, that are made up of multiple panels, that allow for interrelationships, interreligious, multiple discourses. And that's it. Oh, here's the question that I ask my students, and here's the question that I have for you. What is the thing that you care about, that you want Christianity or theology to acknowledge? What is that thing that you want to think about, that you want to investigate, that you want to do critical analysis on? Now go think with your hands. Thank you. I thought we were doing the...
No, we'll do it just us. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just us.
That's interesting. Shannon and I were actually not going to get a Q&A. We were going to have a joint Q&A with all the speakers. So thank you, David, for changing your mind. I appreciate that.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, both of you. It seems to me that what both of you said is integral to a conference like this, which is raising important questions, raising hard questions, asking of us, asking of me, hard questions. And I just want to say thank you. And I don't know what all the answers are, but I trust that your advice, Maria, your prescription, that it involve people being together, making things together is the way forward. So thank you. Thank you for that good word. I'm happy to begin the question asking, unless someone would like to ask a question.
Come on, break this tension, somebody. Come on.
What tension?
Let me ask you, Maria. You have worked in different contexts, You have been in a church context, you've been in a non-church context, you are now in an academic context. Do you see, well, I'll say it this way, I can imagine you see patterns of dysfunction across contexts. I can also imagine that you've seen maybe glimpses of way forward, or moments or practices that give us a hint of a better way of doing things. And so I guess I'm curious to hear, you certainly talk about your time at Fuller, but maybe you just have such a rich backdrop that you bring to your academic studies. You're not 25, starting your PhD, you being a life of I think, experience and knowledge and wisdom. I guess I'm curious to see what hints of better ways of doing things you've seen along the way that give you hope. Academic institutions obviously have dysfunctions that are systemic, genetic. I wonder if there's good news for the academic institution that come outside of it.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think an artist brings to the table is that I'm not, in the classroom, I'm not an authority. My students are the authority. I give them the authority, and we all learn from one another. And so I see that the artist kind of is an equalizer. Being an artist and talking about theology through an art discipline means now, I'm not a musician, I'm not a filmmaker. So, so I think that the arts allow for this is this equalizing base, and therefore I now need to. My job is to, just like it's the Spirit's job, the Holy Spirit's job is to reach and see that potentiality. I mean, that's what artists do, right? Look at the potentiality and bring it up and bring it forward and push it forward. Okay, so I think, the academic institutions, in the perfect world, really, if we go back to the model of education where it's no longer about, it's no longer a commodity of business, if we go back to the understanding of education as building of a whole human being, the encouraging and the edification of a whole human being. If we go back to that model, maybe we can do theology through making, maybe, but we are not in that model at all. Another encouraging thing that I've recently witnessed and felt is that we think that there is a bias against religion in the art world. And most of you have probably been in an MFA program of some sorts, whether it's literature or film, and you've felt that bias, right? But even artists who have to undergo those MFA programs have to stuff down the impetus for why they're making art in the first place. So I had the privilege of working with a former colleague, Kenyon Adams, at Grace Farms, and he invited, for a conversation on joy, 3 secular artists. One was an installation artist, a poet, and a music composer. None of them Christian, and I was the on-site theologian. And so when I got to mirror back to them how deep their work was theologically, one started crying. Because in the academy, in the classroom, they cannot operate from that manner. So there is so hello, theological institution. You are not just, please do not, we need leaders in the world, not just in the church. And so, the problem with, I'm at the end of my, I'm looking for a job, basically. So I had to do these interviews, and, I had this one interview, and they're like, and I do this, and I do that, and they're like, this is a theological institution. We just need a pastor. Can you just teach ethics or systematics? That's what most seminaries want. Yeah, that's why, supposedly Christianity in the West is kind of. So what would be the what would that look? How that look different? How would that look differently, right? If we had if hospitality was part of.
Yeah.
The theological institution, yeah. Sorry.
I actually think the church is doing a better job in some situations than the academy right now with this type of integration. So when I was applying for seminaries, this was a while ago, I looked at Fuller because of the arts emphasis, but I was looking for something Wesleyan, so I ended up at Asbury. And if any of you have done a theological degree and you are also an artist, you've probably been a trailblazer. So I created a degree program at Asbury that doesn't exist anymore. We created a gallery, we created a cohort, it's all gone. And in favor of good things, in favor of missions, in favor of globalization, in favor of good things. But who said those were mutually exclusive? Who said we could do missions without art? Who said we could understand other cultures without art? And I think what Maria has been harping on, so I'm starting a PhD right now too, looking at a Wesleyan theological aesthetic and what I like that the Wesleys bring in. So I showed you hymns. The Wesleys wrote no systematics. They were field preachers. And that's humorously derogatory. But the only documents we have that display their theology are sermons, personal letters, and hymns. So all of the theology that we know about the Wesleyan movement, the Methodist movement, and what's come out of that are primary documents. They're praxis tools. They're praxis, they're art. So their theology was embodied in art. Why has nobody written about this before? Why do seminaries not teach this? Why do seminaries not all have the class that Maria has been working through? Another thing that we work on with our artists in our artist residency program, I don't have a slide, but I'll try to describe it to you. We have 4 quadrants, and it's the 4 quadrants of how artists relate to their faith and how churches relate to artists. So there's 3 of the 4 quadrants are functional quadrants.
Sorry, are artists okay with these quadrant things?
Sometimes.
Okay, because, that's not putting us in the box. Sorry.
No,
okay.
I'm getting there.
Okay, all right.
No, artists are not okay with the boxes. So the quadrants are for when I talk to the pastors, but that's another story.
Okay.
So the quadrants, 3 of the 4 quadrants are functional quadrants. So it's how churches imagine artists fitting into their programming. So you have a quadrant related to teaching. You have a quadrant related to evangelism and justice. You have a quadrant related to spiritual formation. The 4th quadrant is actually identity. Most artists that I've met that would consider themselves like soul artists, vocational artists, they cannot separate out what they make from who they are. That's true. So to be asked to function in a particular way, and that becomes all that you are, is really difficult. And this is what the seminary does. This is what the academic institution does, and to an extent what the church does. And so the point in my talk about know your artists, because their art is inextricably linked to who they are and who God's called them to be. And if you want to understand artists, that's the first thing you need to understand. This isn't just their day job. This is their heart and soul. And I think they have something to teach us about worship and how we live and how we embody our faith and how to move through the political divides we see right now. Yeah.
Shannon, can I ask you just one question and then we'll open it up? Can you give us a story of a church that you've worked with in Seattle that was maybe less inclined to this artist residency, less prepared, less excited maybe, that it ended up being a good thing, that the church itself or the leadership itself experienced a conversion or experienced something that they never imagined possible? Because some churches are very art friendly, some are less. So I'm just curious to know if you have any stories of churches that it really was a healthy growth experience for them and not just good for the artist.
Yes, and it's never clean, as you know. David has a long history of art in the church as well. And I remember actually something you said to me 5 or 10 years ago. I think you were at Hope Chapel for 10 years. And I think I remember you saying that it took that long to even change a part of their culture. So you're turning around a really big ship. And so my artists come into this residency, and it's 9 months. 9 months, pregnancy. It's, but then they get about 3 months in, and they're really frustrated because they're like, nobody cares about what I'm doing. It doesn't matter if the pastor announced it from the pulpit. It doesn't matter if it's in the bulletin. Nobody's coming to that thing that's asking them to come up to the church one more time. So it's a very slow process. It's very much like the leaven parable. And I'm saying, if you can change the opinion of 3 other people in your congregation that can then go on and lead the charge after you're gone, that's huge. So one example I have of that is a Presbyterian church in Seattle. The worship pastor is a friend of mine. She's a musician and an artist at heart. And she brought in a visual artist who did really quirky illustrations that really no one understood. And she chipped away at it throughout that 9 months. And she had a show, and she had a workshop. 9 people came in total that entire 9-month period to anything that she put on. And I remember meeting with her for coffee, and she cried. She's like, why am I even doing this? Because for her, she was putting her whole self into it while working as an adjunct teacher and a waitress. And she put her whole self into this. But we had that conversation about the leaven. Those 9 people that were a part of that workshop have started an arts guild at the church, and they now have a gallery show 3 times a year, and they bring in an artist in residence every year. And so they're also in a pastoral transition, and so it's now become a priority that the new head pastor that they hire has a high value for the arts in the congregation. So they slipped in there in that opportune little moment to say, we want to elevate this as a priority in our congregation because we believe it matters. We believe that artists can help us in our own formation of the image of God, and our own care of culture in the world.
That's a good word for our artists out there right now who feel like invisible and their work doesn't get shown and are not having enough conversations. And, we don't know the impact that our work has sometimes, or even as a teacher, right? So you don't know. You don't know. You have no idea. You walk away, and you don't know, what you've done. So take heart.
All right, any questions? Okay, there's one right there, and there's one back there. Okay, great.
Hello? I feel like several times this week the conversation has been about, creating a space for artists in the church or starting a program in the church. And I'm wondering if you guys foresee the church ever getting to a place where instead of creating something within the 4 walls of the church, they're willing to take their congregants out of the 4 walls, expose them to the art, the world of art, that it's so vast, and teach the congregation how to appreciate art without boundaries and without limitations.
I used to work at a very large church, and I got paid well for it, thank God. So one of the things that we did was this thing called Culture Club. No, not Boy George. So it was my job to buy like 15 tickets to a cultural venue. This is New York City. And so every month on a Friday or Saturday night, I had to go out with 10 to 15 strangers from a very large church. And I have to say, doing that month after month after month, I did see a couple of things. We did this under the philosophy that, part of, if we want art patronage in the church, then we need to be patrons of the arts out in the secular, in our cities. And so, I can't tell you how fellowship binding it is to experience an art, a collective, and so part of my job was actually to also try, if we're going to go to the ballet, try to get a ballerina to come either before or after to kind of talk about it, and to host the evening. And I can't tell you how it binds people together to watch something together or to do something together. And then also hearing in a conversation, you know, we need to do art together, because art, again, is kind of picks your, you know, it expels this critical mode. And so when you begin to see a piece of artwork or a dance through the eyes of another, you get more of that thing. It's really hard to go to a museum by yourself, because, you know? So anyway, what was the question? So Joy, Joy. What was the question for Shannon again?
Oh, I'm with you. I think also there's stigmas that need to be broken down about different types of art. So for example, visual art is, I would say, you can argue with me, but the least understood in the church, except for in really didactic ways, very literal illustrations of biblical themes and things like that. And that's not the case for every church, but I think we're behind the cusp with visual arts, and in particular installation, and I think asking people to go out to a museum also has an air of elitism that some congregations can struggle with. And so there's all these different social barriers that have to be broken down. And I like to talk about the discipleship of the senses. And so if you can start inside the church with baby steps, and then say, okay, we're gonna go outside now. We're gonna step outside. And I don't mean to belittle the people that I worship beside. Like, I don't understand a lot of different cultural things that are really normative for people in my congregation. So it's not just art, but journeying with one another, artists becoming hospitable to people that don't understand their work, which is hard. It's hard when your whole life you've been asked to write something up to describe what you're creating, when the whole point is that you're not using words. But be patient. Be patient with the body of Christ is what I would encourage you to do. It's okay to get angry. It's okay to be impatient sometimes. But I would encourage you to allow the Spirit to give you the fruits that you need to walk alongside those in your congregation. The quote from earlier, don't give them more than they can bear. Shock art can be effective sometimes, but it kind of reminds me of those hell and brimstone kinds of. Did anybody's church, I'm getting a little bit off the rails here, but did anybody's church have the Halloween scare you into salvation things? Sometimes art feels that way to me, and I think we need to think a little bit more hospitably about how to bring people along with us.
Joy, I also think, sorry, I want to piggyback on that. Sometimes, because, you know, we're so detached our heads and our bodies, is sometimes, you know, people are experiencing the aesthetic, the arts, and not even knowing it. And so, or you know, so I remember going to one of Mako's openings, and he had a perfumer. Mako, are you still here? He had a perfumer for that opening night. And so the minute you walked into that gallery space, the first sense that you get was smell. And so, you know, so we have, so we experience a lot of aesthetics things as we walk into a corporate worship. So how are we now more intentional about that? And so that's, yeah. So there's a lot of things already happening in your sanctuary space. How do we become more reflective of what that is? They're experiencing it already. Yeah, so anyway.
Yes. Oh, yeah, for sure. Thomas.
Okay, great. Hi. Okay, so I am a Methodist, mestizo, Hispanic American. So this was like perfect, great. But
thank you, Holy Spirit.
Yeah. But you got me feeling all Latin sassy. So I have a question.
That thing about yelling, right? You know, it's like, hey.
Yeah, I got
right?
it. Yeah.
You know.
I am talking loud.
Yeah, what is that?
Yeah.
While also being warm-hearted.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, okay, so I'm going to try and sum this up as best I can. I can't draw for crap. I'm okay at guitar, and I'm a decent writer, I guess. But so I like to identify as a creative, but I am also very much an academic. So part of the biracial life, you know, is holding things in tension, right? So we have talked a lot about what the artist can bring to academia, how academia should view the artist, how the church should view the artist, all of these things. The question that popped up to me then is the artist fallible? Like, do we just get to make whatever we want to make? Or is the Wesleyan quadrilateral, like teaching someone church tradition matters as a lens? Theology, capital T theology, matters as a lens when you're making art. How do you teach someone those things while also honoring you're an artist who gets to create things like that? So in other words, how do we bring that tension, that Methodist mestizo tension of like, what can the academy offer to an artist while talking about what the artist can offer to
part
an
of getting your master's degree is you have to put on, art is about self-expression. I mean, that's the first thing when my students come in. It's like, okay, yes, it is. But you're a graduate level student. That means you have to reflect on that. So meaning you can't make anything outside of a lens. So you have to recognize what that lens is, and then you have to claim it. That's what I make my students do. I mean, that's my job. Okay, so good for you. Hey, conceptual art, all right? It's all up here, all right? So you could be still creative, and a lot of things could be conceptual. So you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I think my answer is community. A lot of what we do too is, so many of my artists, like if we take a Enneagram, or not Enneagram, the Myers-Briggs, the beginning of the cohort, they're all introverts, except for the rare performing artists that we get. They're introverts. They would very much enjoy being isolated in their studio for like eternity and not ever talking to anybody about their work.
This stuff is exhausting.
But they need people. And artists go to dark places too. So artists are not infallible. They're just like all of us, and they do need boundaries. And I think that is why I'm so passionate about this reconciliation between artist and church. We desperately need to be in community. Artists need to be called out too. We need to be shaped and formed and disciplined by one another, by the liturgy, by the word of God. And so it's not a free-for-all. When I ask you to create space for artists, it's not a splatter paint playground. I mean, it could be. That could be fun. But we have to learn to live in community, and in this kingdom that we're living in is God's kingdom. So yeah, we aren't, as artists, artist personality has a natural propensity for narcissism, egoism, and isolation. And the church counteracts that.
And part of, as you were talking about community, it's not just a community of believers, that's great, but also, we can't make art. Art is always made out from reflection of other art, and so we have to also recognize that we are making art not in a vacuum, that we have to recognize those folks who've gone before us. And our work is, totally derivative of those folks. So.
That's great. Thank you. Well, we're coming to a close here, so let me invite all our presenters to join us here. You can sit wherever you wish. And if you all, just come on down. Don't hesitate. Todd, Ed, Cutter Rob, Roberta, Alexis, Mako. I don't know if you're still here.
Are you ready for a drink?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, this is our last official session together. Then we're having dinner. So if there's somebody that you up here or next to you that you want to have dinner with, this is your opportunity to hang out and have conversation in a leisurely way. But if you have any other questions or thoughts for anybody up here, we welcome your questions. Oh, David. Anybody have any questions? Yes, at the back.
Hi. Thank you, everyone, for speaking. It was a really interesting day. I consider myself an artist, and sometimes I struggle with that word because that thing becomes so important to me. I forget at the end of the day that it's a job, right? Like, we're working. We have a job. And for me, it consumes me to the point where it becomes my primary identity. And I sometimes struggle with it becoming an idol. And I was wondering if any of you also struggle with that and how you have overcome that.
Okay, I'm going to answer that because I used to be an arts minister to artists, so I know the answer to this question. I mean, I'm sure David also had, but basically what I would tell the artists that I was working with is like, we all have affinities, and those affinities and abilities and experiences that we have make us artists. They also, those same affinities and abilities that we have allow us to do other things. So we can take those same things and they could be mom or office worker or the guy who pumps gas. So those are the things, those particular things manifest as artists, but they're not me. I can be other things. And of course I relate that in relation to, first and foremost, oh gosh, this sounds so trite, are my identities in Christ, right? But that's true. And God has given me certain gifts that are for the community, for the building up of the kingdom. And so I have to remember that, and those gifts get utilized depending on where I am, my station in life. They get utilized no matter what. If we want to title it artist, sure. David, you've worked with artists too.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good. I mean, I think the answer will always be healthy community. Is where all this stuff gets laundered out, figured out, worked out, wrestled. Yeah.
I think maybe there's another aspect to that. Last Sunday in church, we had a sermon on the Sabbath. And that it's a good reminder that ultimately it's a gift to us, not something we do.
Yeah, that's right.
And that there's a rhythm in life that should be there, in which we're reminded that what we do isn't all that important, even though it's important. And that that doesn't have to do with community. The community can help us there. But there's a fundamental human rhythm, lest we think ourselves more important than we are.
Let me just say practically, make sure all your mics are clicked on, because they may not be, just so we can all hear you. Thank you. All right, Roberta, one more thought, and then we'll throw it back to you guys.
Well, I'd just like to add that what my discovery, because God took me to Africa, was pulling art out of other people. And so we give of ourselves to others and watch God work through them. And it's an amazing process. I went back to Kenya this summer after being gone for 19 years. I visited, but to see what the Maasai did when and what has developed from a 1999 New Songs for Worship workshop. There are now 22 churches planted in Tanzania, and I'm not bragging, it's that God used it. And they we gifted them hopefully, in creating their own songs and Maasai styles that allowed them to worship God, that pulled others, that attracted them to Jesus Christ. And that's a privilege.
Hey, David, can I
Yes,
answer
you
this
may.
question? I'm learning to be assertive, learning from Maria.
Thank you, Marco.
Well, so as an artist, Maria and I sat under the teaching of Tim Keller, who always had this mantra about idols. Idol is a good thing that has become an only thing. Now, therefore, for something to be an idol, it has to be a good thing. We have to recognize that and say that before you worry about your art being an idol, you should worry about if your art is good. Right? Okay. I'm not that is not a critical judgment on anybody's art. It is simply saying that to me, this question matters to me because God is an artist. Why does God care about idol making? Right? Moses comes down from the mountain, he sees the golden calf, which proves actually that all these people, craftsmen in the chosen people, exiled from Egypt, was trained in Egypt. Why would God do that? In his, place of idols, right? Chosen people, the craftsmen, based on the Holy of, comes out of that. And the first thing they probably participated in, I don't know, but there's no proof of this, no textual proof, but I suspect at least part of the community was involved in using that craft, right? So out of this tainted, messy, chaotic, sin-filled place comes Moses' tabernacle. So God cares about this. It doesn't matter how many times we have fallen to the world's ways and we made ourselves more than what we ought. We didn't take Sabbath seriously, and we misplaced our egos before God's intent for us. All of that seems to me is not the issue. The issue is, how good is art? And how much God cares about that. And to me, everything is about that negotiation of understanding ourselves, humbling ourselves before God, the artist. So.
Alexis?
Yes, this was a question that we had of our music worship leaders. And I actually interviewed them mainly through Skype. What was amazing, 26 people, varied backgrounds. These were exemplars. So these were people that were known for engaging their congregation, but probably about 8 to 10 interviews in, I knew whether I was talking to someone who had what we call God-centric engagement versus performance orientation. Now, performance orientation is important. I'm not talking about pursuing excellence. That is important. But the distinction we were making there, what the worship leaders were saying, a continual focus on glorifying God. And the phrase 24/7, it's not even that common now, right? But they kept on saying that 24/7 is the preparation, not in terms of being a workaholic, right? But realizing that all of your life prepares you for that kind of moment. And the other piece was in looking at humility. They were humble, but the worship leaders that were most humble weren't the ones that were talking about that. They didn't say, I'm humble. We actually developed a process theme, because as I was interviewing them, I could sense the Spirit of the Lord, again, through technology, that the sense of humility, the sense of the fruit of the Spirit that was just emanating from them. So I said to my students, we've got to assess this from a process standpoint. So it was in the relationship. It was coming through in that in-between. And humility is just such an important dimension. But it is a struggle, because you spend so much time on your craft. And you do know that you're working on being good if you're not already good. We get all of that. But this is the wisdom that they had for us.
Anybody else? Have a question of any sort? Yes, sir.
I have now been a fuller student in the Brehm Center for 6 years. And one of the phrases that gets tossed around a lot is breaking down the sacred-secular divide, which frequently means looking for the presence of God in the world. I wonder if any of you would like to speak to inviting the profane into worship.
I think the sacred-secular divide, I just was Marvin Gaye's What's Going On album, was that sacred or secular? It's some of Stevie Wonder's, songs in the key of life, was it sacred, was it secular? And the difference between the blues and the gospel music is really the text. But even in the text, You know, even in blues, they cry out to God at times. And then, Mahalia Jackson said, "I don't sing blues, I sing gospel." And you know, in 2019, I'm like, "You're singing blues," you know. So, you know, I think there's a book called "I Will Die for You," where Torrey is talking about Prince, and it's like 3 chapters. It's really great, and he talks about why was Prince a boomer that was like the big brother to Gen X. And one of the 3 things. One was, you know, his relationship with his parents, and this is the first generation of latchkey kids. 2 was he had a lot of spiritual themes. Purple Rain is kind of a metaphor of baptism, and you know, I Will Die for You is a sacrificial kind of Christ-like theme, and he would talk about a lot of apocalyptic themes. And then the 3rd thing is clearly his whole deal of sexuality. And what's fascinating about that is that Torrey points out the point that even in like the Black church experience, well, 2 things. One is that the way that you deal with stress is either through spirituality or sexuality. To be human is to be both spiritual and sexual. So the stress that Black people were dealing with Monday through Saturday, like Friday, was being kind of detoxed on Saturday night through a physical sexuality, but then a physical spirituality on Sunday morning. And then you had these like 3-hour worship services that, you know, kind of has almost a liturgy of a sexual experience. We have like foreplay, and you kind of kind of go to a climax of the sermon, and then there's kind of maybe even to like a shout, and then there's a relief that kind of happens. And so it's really fascinating, you know, and Prince captures all of this, you know. And so I think some of what gets the divide is that I think part of the divide in a lot of Western culture is that there's a cerebral and a physical divide that in other traditions there is more of an embodied thing. So I think the more that we can be embodied, the more that we can dissolve the sacred secular divide.
Could I just wanted to add briefly to that? It's on. Just briefly, and you're right, there are different ways of looking at it, and worldview perspectives. All of life is sacred. That's what I learned and experienced while I was on the continent of Africa. It's not either or, it's both and.
I actually get tired of that conversation, if I'm being honest. It's the end of the day, so I'm hungry, so my honesty is coming out. But the reason is because I think it actually is, it's a way that we talk about something to avoid talking about what we really should, and that is hospitality. Just going back to what Shannon was saying, what David was saying, is my experience in pastoral ministry. I often joke, I was a pastor for 10 years, and I went the seminary route because I'm a failed pastor. I mean, I really do carry around this deep sense of failure. I didn't know how to do it because I kept feeling like people were telling me that's not allowed in here. The things you're bringing in this isn't the place for it. And I was like, I don't understand. Like, this is life. This is the things. So when I suggest, apparently scandalously, that, you know, okay, pre-2016 Kanye West. So imagine 15 years ago that I bring in some Kanye West to a sermon and we talk about John the Baptist and Kanye West, you know, that somehow is upsetting to people. Or, I mean, people threatened to leave my church because I dared not just to show the early Inconvenient Truth film in a series on Genesis, but really because Al Gore's face was on the screen. And actual people saying, we're leaving and we're taking our money. And so as I thought through that, I thought it was a sacred secular thing. But what I think it is this notion of, if you read John Caputo, he talks about hospitality, and I've said this a million times, so sorry if it's redundant, but But we get this word hospitality from the Latin word hostis, which is the host, our communion host. It's to host others. It's where we get hospital, hostel, etc. Hospitality, but it's also the same word where we get hostile. So in a true Christian sense, hospitality isn't just inviting into my most intimate spaces people who are my friends and are going to return the favor. It's inviting the hostile into my space to disrupt me. And nobody likes that. I don't like it. I don't like it when I have to sit and hear Maria say what she said, because I go, oh, I have feelings, right? I have feeling things. But wait, isn't that what artists do? Yes, but I don't want to feel those feelings, right? That's, right? I mean, that's the most profound art, is the stuff that it made you feel something you didn't already think you should feel, right? And that's, I think, where we should go in terms of what does it look like for the arts? What does it look like for sacred secular conversation? It's, can we be a people that actually invites our enemy into our midst and loves them for the sake of them disrupting us?
The other side of that is, I think it has to do with too small an understanding of God. I'm more and more convinced that our pneumatology is too picayune or too small. That even though we've had a revolution of the Holy Spirit in terms of the Pentecostal charismatic movement, that's all having to do with the Spirit of Christ. I don't know whether my experiment will work here, and if it doesn't, it's a bad illustration, but let me try. If you were to pick which of the creeds you're more comfortable with or know more or have said more in church, I'm going to give you two choices, the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed, okay? How many of you would raise your hand on the Apostles' Creed as one that you use more often than the Nicene Creed? How many would put the Nicene Creed? Only two panelists, 3, 4. It's the Nicene Creed that talks about the Spirit as rooted in creation and creator. It's the Nicene Creed that talks about the Spirit as the giver of life. And there's a sense in which we as Protestants have relegated the Spirit to that which illumines Scripture and helps the church. And that's part of what the Spirit does, but that's not all that the Spirit does. And I think hospitality is a big part of it. All that you've said is right. But I think there's actually a theological deficiency within the church that also has to be addressed.
So my dissertation is actually on hospitality. And so coming off of what you're saying is basically, you're right, we see God too small, and we don't understand God's hospitality. And that we are, as Christians, we sit at Christ's table, that we are always hosting guests at the same time, just like Christ is always hosting guests. So, okay.
Thank you. I think it's 5:45. Is that right? And our dinner is around this time, I think. So I just want to honor the folks that are hosting us. Anybody on the panel here wish to say one last word of encouragement or something to...
Yeah, I would like to thank David Taylor for a wonderful job
hosting
today. It's very hard to corral a bunch of artists and teachers. And he's done a great job. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Well, let me just end with this thought. And as I kind of absorb, simmer, process the things that have been said and shared, I keep thinking of tables and thinking of our work together as following in Jesus's work, and thinking about some of the work that he does involves overturning tables. Some of the work involves going to other people's houses, tables, like inviting himself to Lazarus' table. And the chief work that he does is inviting the like and the unlike at a common table. And those who were enemies become friends at that table. And having grown up in Latin America, where so much of life transpires around tables, and the table's a place where things happen and stuff is made, and it's tangible and it's aesthetic, and there are exchanges that take place, and it might be short or it might be long, but there's no going around that formative work of the table. So in whatever way that image of table may help provide some kind of common thread, I commend it to you. But I also trust that the Holy Spirit has been at work in and among us and with you. And my prayer for you is that God will preserve something in your heart or mind or imagination that you can take away from this conference to make tangible the peace of Christ, the shalom of Christ, the hospitality of Christ. And I'm very grateful that we get to share a dinner together as the last part of our conference is not an aftermath, it's part of the conference. So we welcome you to dinner. We thank you so much for traveling and spending time to be with us. And we pray the blessing of God on you this day and all days to come. Amen. Thank you.
If you haven't gotten enough, Friday will be a good day for we at the Brehm Center. I'm going to put you on the spot for a minute. Friday afternoon, one of the things we experienced today is the power of testimony. However honest, however uncomfortable, however inspiring, testimonies are powerful. On Friday at 1 o'clock to 2:30, the Brehm Center and the Pinnell Center are inviting Thomas Wilkinson, who is conducting the music of the Harlem Renaissance at Disney Hall next Saturday and Sunday, to tell about growing up in the projects as the son of a single mother to becoming the preeminent African-American conductor in North America, and his journey of faith as an artist and all that he had to overcome. So I invite you to that. And if that's not enough, Friday night,
we will have the epitome of hospitality. We'll be showing the Fred Rogers movie, Won't You Be My Neighbor? And we'll have a discussion and a panel afterwards. Fred, I think, was as good an example of somebody who welcomed people and made them at ease. And it should be a great evening, so we welcome you here at this same place at Friday evening next week.
So in Seattle, if you feel like coming up north, we are having another conference on April 5th, similar in style to this conference, and you are invited to join us for that as well.
If you don't know where dinner is, you can ask any one of us or any one of the staff, and we'll take you across. It's at Peyton Hall for dinner.
Oh, okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you, presenters.